Hello, hello. Welcome to this masterclass on IBS. I'm Carrie Sink. I'm a woman's holistic health coach, and I specialize in helping women get rid of chronic constipation and improve gut health. I am really excited for today's class. We're going to be talking about irritable bowel syndrome, why it's more than irritating, and what you can do to get your healthy life back. Joining me and presenting this class is Kelly Wilhite. Kelly is a holistic health practitioner and coach, and she specializes in the digestive system and gut. Her personal journey in overcoming chronic health struggles, including IBS and other gut issues, is a catalyst to her, helping others find relief from suffering. So grab a cup of something good and grab a notebook, grab a pencil, and get ready, because this class is jam-packed full of so much good information. You're going to want to take notes. I also encourage you to let go of any distractions, maybe silence your phone, let the dog out, whatever you need to do so you can be present in this class. Something really cool after following this masterclass is that Kelly and I are going to be doing follow-up special Q&A classes to answer any of your IBS questions that you may have. So take notes, write them down in your notebook, and send them to me after the class, and we will get them answered. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Kelly. Take it away.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the slide deck now. Can you see everything okay, Carrie?
Yes, we're good to go.
Right. So I just want to say a big welcome and hello to all who are watching. It really is my pleasure to help bring more awareness to those who suffer from digestive and gut problems, and IBS is a big part of that. So that's why I decided to do this masterclass on IBS. So thank you again, Carrie, for giving me the opportunity to do this. So let's face it. Conventional medicine just isn't set up to help those with IBS long-term or gain long-term relief from their struggles. I have such a great passion to help others have freedom from their ongoing health struggles, and part of that is educating folks like you so you are as informed as possible to make wise decisions and take appropriate actions to get your healthy life back, because it truly is possible. Just to help you learn a little bit more about me, I am a fully certified health coach. I studied for my master's in public health and nutrition, and some of my specialty training does include intensive training on the digestive system and gut conditions. And I've been mentored and received other education from various functional medicine doctors. But what I believe contributes greatly actually to being qualified to those who struggle from gut problems is that I have suffered myself for decades actually, and I can relate to the physical, emotional, and mental toll it can take. I won't go into all the details of my story as I don't want to take up any more of your precious time, but you can go to my website to learn more about me. So without further delay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so excited to help you discover more about IBS and why it's more than irritating, and how you can absolutely get your healthy life back. And for what seems like an endless supply of struggle, actually, I can relate to sometimes it feeling like you're having that boulder, right? That boulder that you're having to drag around wherever you are. The challenge and struggles can be relentless. So I want to take you through what we're going to learn today and discover about IBS in this masterclass. We're going to start out with some general information and overview about IBS, and then I'm going to provide symptoms that people suffer and why it's more than irritating. And we'll talk about what it's like to live with IBS. And it may surprise many, but symptoms are not just the typical gut problems we struggle, but there's so much more to it. And we'll get into more detail as we go through the presentation, because I really want you to understand about IBS. I'd also like to focus on how you can have relief from your symptoms and freedom from IBS so that you can feel healthy and confident in your skin. The fact is, your IBS does not have to hold you back from doing the things you love and enjoying your life. You can get your healthy life back, and I, along with many clients, will attest to that. I'm also going to give a good foundation about the complexities of our digestive system and things that can actually go wrong. I'm not sure about you, but with me and many others, when we understand how things work behind the scenes, we're better at taking steps to address anything that has to do with that behind the scenes situation. An example would be how many parents ask their children to do something and their parents say, because I said so. A child would be more apt to learn and take action when they understand why. And adults really are like that too. We want to understand why if we're going to take action. So understanding the workings behind the scenes and why things go astray will help us move forward in being able to be more adept, motivated, and persistent in making changes as we await our positive results. I'm going to talk about root cause frequently throughout, as identification of root cause is a key to someone truly having freedom from their IBS. Our symptoms certainly help guide us, but we also have to take our eyes off our symptoms, which are downstream, and investigate to see where they're coming from. But that doesn't mean we forget about symptoms. We can be helping to calm them down as we work to uncover and address the root causes. So we'll talk about remedies for your systems and at the same time be working towards identifying and addressing root causes. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So we're on an IBS overview, and most common the most common disorder that are diagnosed by gastro or gastroenterologist doctors is IBS. Basically, when they don't have a test to say, oh, that's what it is, they just label it IBS. It can be really frustrating. And there's 4 different types of IBS. I'm not sure if anyone has explained this to you or your doctor, but there's IBS-D, which is a more diarrhea dominant, IBS-C, which is more constipation dominant, IBS-M, which is mixed, and IBS-U, which is U is for unsubtyped, so it basically doesn't fall in the other 3. Now, I want to be clear that IBS is not considered the same as IBD, irritable bowel disease. It is not IBD, and IBD, what's characterized in IBD is Crohn's, things like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, which those are a couple of autoimmune conditions. Now, IBS is irritable bowel syndrome. Syndrome means that it's a diagnosis based on symptoms with the cause being unknown. They basically don't have a specific test, although we're gonna talk about a specific test, but for years they haven't had any testing specifically for IBS. What they do is they rule things out. So they'll do testing for visible signs of intestinal damage, like you've probably heard of colonoscopies, endoscopies, and of course MRIs and CAT scans. So they're going to rule out any visible signs of problems, and then if they can't find anything in those areas, they're going to label it IBS. So this is where IBS can be more than irritating. When I say that, I'm not just referring to the aggravating and sometimes debilitating symptoms. I'm also referring to the fact that IBS is just the diagnosis saying we really have no idea what the problem is. And likely those individuals are prescribed a medication to deal with the symptoms, and even then it may not help, and it can give, undesirable side effects from the medications. So as irritating as it is understandable, though, that most GI doctors don't go any further than the IBS diagnosis. I fully respect their medical school training and how they help us in acute and emergency care, because that is essential. But honestly, medical school does not teach about holistic solutions and identification of root cause and addressing the underlying reasons. Its focus is on diagnosis and treating symptoms with pharmaceuticals. And that's just not going to help those with IBS overcome their struggles. It needs not long-term. The fact is, the cause of IBS is usually a combination of things, and that combination is unique to each person. We have to be very careful about comparing symptoms with the symptoms of others and making root cause assumptions for ourselves. I always caution my clients that if you take 5 people having the same exact symptoms, their root cause and triggers can be completely different for each of them. In the same respect, you could take 5 people with similar root causes but have differing symptoms. So it can be quite complex. Now, it's about a 60-40 split between men and women. So women are generally affected by IBS more, and it's not too surprising because more women have autoimmune conditions, and autoimmune conditions do stem initially from gut problems. So the 60-40 split is not too surprising. There's 10 to 15% of people in the US have IBS. I say that likely more because a lot of people have issues and they aren't either diagnosed or they haven't even gone to the doctor because of them. And then the lifetime risk is at 30%. Now, that means that over, of course, your life, you're at a 30% risk of developing IBS, and that actually is a higher risk than cancer and is a similar risk to that of diabetes. So it's a pretty big deal. And then I also wanted to mention, we're going to talk a little bit more about testing later on in the presentation, but I did want to highlight there's actually a new test out. And these are specialty tests. Most regular doctors don't do them, to identify a specific potential IBS autoimmune issue. Actually, not all IBS is considered autoimmune, but this test will identify with a 90% accuracy whether or not someone's IBS is actually autoimmunity. And then we'll talk about some other testing. Okay, so let's take a look at what it's like to live with IBS, and it really can be miserable. If you notice, I indicate various other struggles that span the whole body, not just GI troubles. You know, we've got the GI up here, but there's all kinds of all these other issues that span the body that most people would not associate, like eczema and anxiety or fatigue, stress and confusion and pain. Those are generally not associated with gut problems and with IBS, but they are absolutely part of it. So it's so important to understand that IBS can actually result in both problems in and outside the gut. Now, most of the people that I work with digestive and gut problems, but I have and continue to work with others because of their condition can be improved when they have a healthy functioning digestive system and gut. So they may not originally come to me because of gut problems, but that is like a high priority to work on. For instance, I worked with a client who had type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune diabetes, not the type 2 diabetes that is completely controllable through nutrition and lifestyle. And he noticed amazing improvement when we worked on his gut health. And then I also worked with a client who was diagnosed with POTS, which is a circulatory disorder. And again, we worked on her gut and she had improvements with her POTS symptoms. So it very well could be that if you're having issues outside the gut, they're highly relatable to what's going on inside your gut. And I think everyone is familiar with the term, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, that's not true with the digestive and gut problems. What happens in the gut or any dysfunction in the GI system does not stay in the gut. Problems can span the entire body, as I previously mentioned. And you can see that here on this particular side. You have all of these issues, these miserable issues that can happen inside the gut. But take a look, you have just as many that can actually happen outside the gut. So I want to share a story about one of my clients who came to me because she initially came to me with her higher priority goal of getting rid of her burning mouth syndrome. She also had heartburn, difficulty with weight loss, bloating, gas, constipation, and stomach pain. Now, even though she had already been seeing a conventional doctor that was even much more open-minded than the typical doctor, he was still not actually able to help her. She was very frustrated. She came to me, and when I worked with her, we uncovered nutrition deficiencies, food sensitivities, low stomach acid, dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of bacteria in our gut, and some other things that were not optimal in her system. So, and kind of go off tangent a little bit. Speaking of not optimal, we have to be really careful about just hearing. You know, we've heard so many times, well, your tests are normal. And you know you're not feeling right, but your tests are normal. And then that's it. Everything we think all is well and good. But that is many times not the case. The reference range for typical tests regular doctors order is based on healthy individuals. And it's based on the absence of disease diagnosis and not on optimal wellness. That's so important to understand. So there are normal ranges and optimal ranges. And if anyone is already suffering with noticeable symptoms, Their body is signaling that something is wrong and it should not be ignored, regardless if the typical test results are so-called normal. So back to my client who had normal test results, when we did further functional testing and specialty testing, that was not the case. So I worked with her to have whatever tests she could have done through her regular doctor that insurance would cover, or tests she couldn't get done with her doctor, like an endoscopy. And I also guided her to specialized testing she could order directly online without her doctor, so we could dig deeper. And after what I previously mentioned as uncovering, nutrient deficiencies, food sensitivities, low stomach acid, dysbiosis, and other issues, we worked on a dietary and supplemental nutrition plan and lifestyle changes that were suited for her specifically. There is no one size fits all. So she ended up losing weight, and there was no dieting, no calorie or macro counting, anything like that. She just reduced a lot of her inflammation. And all her complaints were actually gone, with the exception of her burning mouth and heartburn. All her other gut problems and her weight loss issues, they all resolved, but she was still not quite as frequent and not quite as severe, but she was still dealing with some heartburn and burning mouth. And so I'm sorry. So I kept digging. Now, when we first began working together and discussing her symptoms and health goals, I asked if she ever had an endoscopy. And I mentioned that once before, an endoscopy. She had not. And throughout her program with me, I encouraged it. But we kept working through the program, and she hadn't yet done that, and talked with her doctor about it. So nearing the end of her 3-month program, she signed on to continue with me some more. And I helped her work with her doctor to get the endoscopy ordered and also get it covered by insurance. So she ended up having the endoscopy finally, and lo and behold, it showed a hiatal hernia. So this is where there were some structural issues that were going on. So we then worked on a plan on how to address the hernia in order to keep it from resulting acid coming up into her esophagus and triggering her heartburn and her burning mouth. So she's seen even more significant improvement and no longer suffers like she did. So you can see that it's so important to just keep digging. So here's a little more about why it's so irritating, and we never want to settle. We just don't want to settle with an IBS diagnosis. The buck should not stop there, or to say it boldly, you will not have long-term freedom from your struggles. We can get so caught up with having a label, such as a diagnosis, that we lose sight of the big picture and how to handle it. Who wants to settle for a medication for the rest of their life, to target a symptom, or to be told there's nothing you can do, or you'll just never be able to tolerate many foods again? Because it's really just not true. If you want long-term release, you have to dig deeper to identify the root cause. So what do you do about it? If you go after every symptom that pops up individually, you may have short-term relief, but it provides a false sense of it's over, I'm healed, which is usually never the case. Things continue to brew and get worse because the underlying problem or problems were not addressed. So chasing a diagnosis and stopping at you have IBS or just managing the symptoms is false and fleeting fix. So what's better? Like I've mentioned, it's better to identify and address the root causes. This is going to be your wisest solution, and it's going to bring you sustainable freedom. I'm so passionate about the fact that you can have freedom from IBS. Your days, or even for some of you, your life, doesn't have to go on hold because of IBS. You can make commitments without having to cancel because of gut troubles. You don't have to wonder if you're going to have to sneak out of a social situation or to go to the bathroom or to release that gas that you just cannot hold in any longer. Your cramping and pain doesn't have to end you in the ER because it's become so excruciating, and after hours of being in a fetal position, you can't take that pain any longer. A few years ago, my poor husband was in the ER 3 times over the course of a couple months, and all his GI doctor would say is, your colonoscopy, your endoscopy, your CAT scans, your blood tests, everything shows fine. You have IBS. Here's a PPI and some pain medication. And that's really what he was prescribed to deal with it. I was livid, of course. I knew there was a lot more to it. And so we took matters into our own hands. And so I helped my husband dig deeper. And over time, he made some changes and he hasn't had a problem in a couple years. I don't ever want someone to give up hope. It is absolutely possible to be free from IBS. So in the essence of discovering root cause as to being the best thing to do about your IBS, I wanted to provide a visual. Hopefully this does it for you, a visual that may help you understand and remember this concept. So in the functional medicine world, we talk about upstream and downstream. What's going on downstream are all your symptoms. You see, it's pretty chaotic. There's a lot of misery going on down there. And this is happening even if you don't notice it. Our body sometimes takes a while before our symptoms become noticeable. So what's happening is things are accumulating and it seems just fine, right? We have a nice flowing river and things seem fine, but that's when things are accumulating and brewing before they actually signal to you that there's something going on. So in this accumulating and brewing stage, actually, this can go on for years and even decades with some people before something's happening. So when we all of a sudden start noticing symptoms or we get diagnosed with a disease and so forth, it just did not happen overnight. Things have been happening in your body for quite some time. It just decided now that it was going to be noticeable and signal. And so that's what happens, and I like to call that the perfect storm, is something eventually just takes our body over the edge, and then chaos happens, and the symptoms start to show up. And so, of course, upstream is where the root, what is going on upstream, and this is where we want to get to the root of it, because the symptoms down here are not going to be, you're not going to have freedom for them long term if you don't get to the root of what's going on upstream. Now, the severity of symptoms is not necessarily the same for everyone and not an indication of root causes being the same. So we talked about that, right? We want to be careful about comparing ourselves to other situations and other people. Each person is unique, and what's happening and why in their body can be completely different than another who may have similar symptoms. So as I mentioned before, it's super important not to compare yourself with others who have IBS, as we are all different. And as I just indicated, we have to remember that once a symptom becomes noticeable, it is clearly telling you something is your body wrong, and your body is signaling us. Once symptoms come upon us, unless some acute infection or recent activity like an accident or surgery, the problems have generally been brewing, as I mentioned, for quite some time. And I mentioned that's like the perfect storm. We may start off with no symptoms and then things progress and it can get quite debilitating. And I actually was nearly at a point where I was on bedridden because mine were so bad. So next I want to share what happens with digestion and what's involved throughout the process so you can really understand the complexities and what can go wrong. This is where, when I talked earlier, that we want to understand the behind the scenes and what's going on so you can understand the why behind what's happening. So here we have the digestive system, and we don't necessarily have to go through all of this detail, but I wanted to actually show what our formal anatomy looks like. And then I made it easier over here. So what I want you to do is I want you to touch your cheek on your face, and then I want you to touch your bum. From cheek to cheek, our digestive tract reaches for all the way from cheek to cheek. And that's so important to understand. It's not just the middle of our body. And we have hormones and nerves that work together to support our digestion, and signals flowing within the GI tract and also between the GI and the brain. And some of you may have heard that our gut is our second brain. And this is one of the reasons why our gut health is very closely tied to our brain and neurological health. Now, let's talk a little bit about digestion. Digestion actually begins in the mouth, right? So we touched our cheek on our face. Digestion begins in our mouth. That's why it's so incredibly important that we chew our food as well as possible before we swallow. And also, we do have some enzymes, some salivary enzymes that actually start the digestion process in our mouth. And then from there, and of course, this is gonna be more high level, of course, but I did want to give you a little bit of a understanding what's going on. So then food moves down into our stomach, and our stomach has stomach acid or hydrochloric acid, which is very important for protein digestion, but it also kills pathogens, and it also enables us to absorb B12 and iron, for instance, and some other things better. And it actually stimulates other digestive juices to start occurring. So when someone has low stomach acid, like I mentioned about my other client, and I actually have that, you can do something about it. But when someone has low stomach acid, it can absolutely impede your digestion and create inflammation in your gut. So next we have the pancreas. And the pancreas is the key organ that provides the enzymes that the various enzymes that break down our food. We also have the gallbladder, and the gallbladder is very important. It does store the bile acids that actually help to emulsify the fats. So we have stomach acid, we have enzymes, and we have bile acids that actually help to emulsify fats and break down protein and break down carbohydrates in the other digestive juices. And there's a little bit of confusion that some people have. The gallbladder actually stores our bile. The liver actually is what produces our bile. So yes, you can live, and we've heard it many a times, and unfortunately, conventional medicine is very apt to take someone's gallbladder out thinking it's not that big of a deal. It is a very big deal if someone does not have a gallbladder, but they can support their digestion without it. So it's not, you can do things to avoid impeding your digestion when you don't have a gallbladder. And then next, moving down into the digestive tract, we have the small intestine. And this is where all our macros, carbs, protein, and fats, this is where all our macros are absorbed into our small intestine, except for the fiber. Fiber is not digested, and that moves along into our colon. And this is where our macros are broken down, and 80% of our nutrients are absorbed in our small intestine. So we're going to talk about that. When the small intestine gets damaged, that's a huge problem and creates a cascade of health issues. And then we have the colon. The colon absorbs water, absorbs some minerals and nutrients, and bacteria in our colon actually produce some additional nutrients for us, like short chain fatty acids and some B vitamins and vitamin K. So you can see that there is a lot going on throughout our entire digestive tract, and there's so many areas about it, and there's so many things that can go wrong. So that's why I really wanted you to understand. And then many have heard the saying, you are what you eat. And it means that being healthy is about eating healthy foods. But that's not fully true. You are what you eat, what you digest, and what you absorb. So we have to be sure that someone could have the most perfect diet, but if they have gut troubles, if they have a gut that doesn't have optimal functioning digestion and has inflammation and so forth, they're not going to digest things properly, and they're not going to absorb nutrients properly, and then things are also going to get into their bloodstream that aren't supposed to be there, that's going to wreak havoc. So the fact is that it's not just about nutrition. Now, I want to talk about the parasympathetic, or PNS, which is the rest and digest state, and the sympathetic nervous system, SNS, or fight or flight. So parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest; sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. Now, we have and our system goes through both of these. What we don't want is to be in sympathetic all the time. That's going to horribly impair our digestion. So what happens in our digestive system is that we have this vagus nerve that actually starts, it's at our spine near our brain, and goes all the way through our entire digestive system. So again, this is why our gut is called the second brain. There's high interconnection between our gut and our brain. You know, our vagus nerve was responsible for things like heart and respiratory rates, perspiration, anxiety, controls muscle movement, and it also helps food move through the digestive system. and so much more. So it's incredibly important to have a strong vagus nerve, but in many folks that have gut troubles, the vagus nerve has been damaged. Now, if the body is in full alert, like fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, we can be angry or in fear, or we are highly stressed. It's not going to focus on digestion. It just isn't, which is why it's so key not to be eating when we're stressed, and when we're rushing around and things like that. Now, when in the sympathetic state, the body's being prepared to face the alerting situation, and that's normal. We need that, but we don't need it all the time. And what happens with a lot of people with gut troubles is they're in this fight or flight state all the time, which means they are the digestion is being highly impaired on an ongoing basis. So that creates a cascade of effects because of that. And because, again, it's the PNS system, the rest of the digest system, that is responsible to be turned on so that we can digest well. It stimulates the digestive secretions, which is what we talked about, secretions like stomach acid, bile acids, and the enzymes. It helps with the muscle contractions to move the food through the digestive system. It helps with blood flow and absorption of nutrients. So it's incredibly important to work on not being in a chronic state of fight or flight. So now that we've covered an overview of the digestive system, you can see this spans a large area and a great number of functions and processes, and a multitude of things can go wrong to cause problems. So let's take a look at what can go wrong. So we talked about the digestive juices, the enzymes, the stomach acid and bile, and there's various different reasons why these would not be working or being secreted appropriately. And that's going to be a problem. That's going to really impair digestion, and then the cascade of damage and inflammation occurs at that point. Another thing that can go wrong is our microbiome imbalance. You know, there's 100 trillion microorganisms in our gut that influence our immune system, our metabolism, our nutrition. And so when this is imbalanced, it can wreak a lot of havoc. I mean, 80% of our immune system is actually in our gut. Studies show that 83% of patients with IBS have abnormal fecal biomarkers, which would mean that there would be dysbiosis or an imbalance in the microbiome. So just one round, believe this or not, one round of antibiotics can alter our microbiome and leave us vulnerable to a cascade of problems starting in the gut and spanning outside the gut. And microbiome doesn't only refer to the gut, but also our oral microbiome. So I know we're talking about IBS, but we also talk that our digestive tract starts in our mouth, and we have an oral microbiome, bacteria in our mouth, also good and bad bacteria. So that's why it's incredibly important, and why some people actually get quite sick when they've had some mouth work done. Maybe they had a root canal or some other type of mouth work done, and they get sick afterward. There's a lot of damaging bacteria in the mouth that can flood into our bloodstream, causing, besides gut troubles, causing heart troubles and things like that. So it is so important to have a good microbiome, both through our entire digestive tract, not just in our colon. And then another thing that can go wrong is there's pathogens and infections, right? There's parasites, bacteria, there's good and bad bacteria, actually, fungus and yeast and things like that. Infections cause a lot of disruption and inflammation in our gut, not just inflammation in the gut, but systemic inflammation that affects our brain, our skin, our joints, and autoimmunity. So the pathogens and infections really do need to be addressed. Now, we're going to have some parasites. We all have some kind of parasites and maybe bad bacteria. We're going to have that. That's part of our gut ecosystem, but we have to make sure that we manage it appropriately. And then, based on a toxin produced by bacteria associated with food poisoning, some folks who have had food poisoning can actually create certain antibodies that attack the gut. So that's what one of the things I was talking about IBS as a possible autoimmune element to it. And there is a test now, which I actually just got my test results back this week on that. And I actually have autoimmune respect to my IBS, which was a bit frustrating to hear. However, I have several other autoimmune conditions, so it wasn't terribly surprising. I've had food poisoning a number of times. But what happens is the bacteria from that food poisoning actually affects some of our antibodies in our body, and then it causes an autoimmune reaction. Now, another thing with the pathogens and infection is that the waste product from the pathogens, or kind of a poop from the pathogens, also makes us sick. So we have to remember that when we're doing things to eradicate certain pathogens and infections, we could have that die-off effect and feel pretty lousy. There are things that we can do about that, however. You don't have to suffer miserably as you're trying to address these things. Another thing that can go wrong is SIBO. And SIBO stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. This is where good bacteria can actually feed or could actually get from our colon, and too much of it gets into our small intestine where it's not supposed to do, and it triggers all kinds of gut symptoms. And so the fact is that 60 to 80% of those with IBS actually have SIBO. SIBO is another symptom, of course. You have to keep diving deeper, but it could also be causing, it could actually be the SIBO that's actually causing a lot of the IBS symptoms. And then the next is damage to the mucosal lining and small intestinal barrier, which I mentioned earlier. This is one of the reasons why IBS and the cascade of damage in the gut can begin inflammation that spans outside the gut and can result in numerous symptoms and conditions in the entire body. When there's ongoing damage in the small intestinal barrier, which we're going to look at a little bit closer on the next slide, we call this hyperpermeability or leaky gut. Now, there is some permeability, of course, in our intestinal barrier, but when it becomes hyperpermeable, it's what we also call leaky gut, which many of you might be familiar with. So as I mentioned, damage to the mucosal lining and small intestinal barrier can lead to leaky gut. And this barrier is somewhat, as I mentioned, naturally permeable, right, to allow for nutrients and so forth to come through the area in the intestinal lining. But what happens is that when it gets leaky, so to speak, is that these villi here get damaged, and the tight junctions also become wider and inflamed. And what happens, besides nutrients being malabsorbed at this point, other things get into our bloodstream that shouldn't be there. This is one of the things that can trigger autoimmunity, because our body begins to see these things that are coming into our bloodstream as foreign invaders. And so it's very important that we have a very strong intestinal barrier, because it separates the inside of our small intestine with our bloodstream. And again, when it gets leaky, we have malabsorption issues, nutrient deficiencies, and also things get into our bloodstreams like pathogens and other things that can cause a lot of problems. This is one of the reasons we see a lot of food sensitivities and not being able to tolerate a number of foods. Now, of course, there's food intolerances, which are actually different than food sensitivities, and we won't have time to get into all that detail, but this definitely contributes to food sensitivities. Now let's take a look at what can go wrong relating to structural or mechanical dysfunction. So we have what we call motility, which is the movement of muscles and also nerves and so forth through our digestive system. And there's two parts to motility, right? When we eat, we move the food and digestive material along. And then when we're fasting, which is incredibly important, when we're fasting, we have what's called a MMC, migrating motor complex function that occurs. And this can also get highly damaged for various different reasons. But this is what's happening from our motility when we haven't eaten, and we need at least a 4-hour time span from eating, snacking, or any kind of food for this to work appropriately. And this is where fasting is so important, like the overnight fasting of at least 12 hours. And we don't have to, everybody doesn't have to do long fasting or long intermittent fasting, but when we can have a good amount of time for this migrating motor complex to work, it's kind of like a housekeeping. So it sweeps undigested material and pathogens and things through the GI system. And that's what's happening when we are not eating. So it's so important that for you, those of you that graze and eat every few hours, that can actually cause more problems for your digestive system. So again, not a one size fits all. What we used to hear about grazing is so important. Not so much with everybody. You know, when we look at the structural problems, these can be adhesions and scar tissues. Every time we have a surgery, there is going to be scar tissue and adhesions that develop. It just happens. So if you've had abdominal surgeries, and I've had several, there's going to be scar tissues and adhesions that can get in the way of our motility. And even if there's been an accident or an infection and so forth, it can cause motility issues. Now, it seems like a rote answer or a quick fix these days to just say your problems are because of stress. But it is true. Stress plays a huge role in our mental, emotional, and physical health. It's not ambiguous, though. We don't have time to get into all the details today, but stress actually does trigger physiological changes in our body that affect our mental and bodily functions. So let's look a little deeper when it comes to the reasons for stress. So first, stress is not inherently bad, right? We have an innate ability to handle and manage acute stress through our sympathetic nervous system, which we talked about earlier. That's the fight or flight system. It's okay to have that, right? When we're afraid and running away from a lion, or we're in a fearful situation, it's an acute situation, it's normal to be in fight or flight. What's not normal is for our body to stay in fight or flight when we have infections and different stressors, pain, and even not getting enough sleep, because there's so much recovery that happens during our sleep. Even negative mindset and emotions is an internal stressor. Medications are a stressor. They're not natural to our body. So all of these type of things and more are internal stressors. So if all these things are constantly going on, then that means we're in the constant state of sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight or flight. And that's what keeps us chronically not well. So we discussed that when that is happening, then we're not in the rest or digest state, which is the parasympathetic system. And then our digestion is always impaired. So the external factors, of course, are any kind of chemicals and additives in our food, right? We're bringing them in from the external. Things that we put on our skin, the chemicals, whether it's lotions and sunscreens and all that have the chemicals in them. You know, our skin is an organ, and we shouldn't be putting anything on our skin that we would not put in our mouth, literally. Because it's that important in the pollutants that we put on our skin and the pollutants that we breathe. These are all types of external stressors. So that's why it's imperative to take action to avoid these stressors. And you know, we can't control everything, but let's work on what we can control. So in the next handful of slides, we're going to talk about what you can do to fix your IBS. All right, let's look at a big picture. First of all, I would say you probably don't want to, if you're already having issues, you don't wait, and you want to start now. And what you do to do that is going to be different for everyone, right? There's no one size fits all. So whether you're doing it yourself or seeking an expert, this is a complex problem-solving activity. But if you want long-term freedom and long-term release, you're going to have to start somewhere. And it's so important to look beyond your symptoms. We know the symptoms are happening, but we want to look upstream, right? We talked about that. We want to look upstream, and testing will likely have to be a part of your investment, or you're going to be going at it blindfolded. And we're going to talk a little bit more about testing, but there are a ton of other things you can be doing about your IBS before you have to go that far. even when you're seeking the root causes, right? You do want to identify and address root causes, but you don't have to be miserable while you're doing that. You can take what I like to call the triage approach. And that is kind of like, you've heard that term when you go to the ER and you're dealing with some acute situation, is you need to absolutely manage it right then and there, whether it's through medications or natural remedies. You do need to make sure that you're managing symptoms if they've become so debilitating and really impacting your life. But what you don't want to do is stop there. You don't just want to stop at managing your symptom. And even if you feel better, you think everything's gone, because that's just false. It's just not true. So I want to share with you about an overview on what you can do to rebuild your gut and overcome your IBS. Now, there's a lot on this screen, but what I want you to understand is that there is a process to it, and this doesn't necessarily have to happen in this particular order, but these are all the key elements. I call it the 5 R's in LC for Life Care, to rebuilding your gut. So this is what it looks like to address your IBS situation from a high level. How do I do this process? To help put your mind around it all. And then, of course, what each person does within all of these categories is going to be unique to that person and that person's history and medical condition. But all of these items are key. And as I mentioned, you don't necessarily have to be doing them in any particular order, but there are some things that you don't want to do before you do others. And that's, when you're working with a practitioner, that's what they can help you really guide you through that. So let's talk about these particular items. So some of the remove and replace items. So removing, when we're talking about removing, for instance, irritants and stressors, you want to remove things and work on your nutrition. So you want to remove inflammatory foods, avoid your foods that you're sensitive to. You want to, as we talked about, external stressors, you want to remove toxins, you want to eradicate infections. You want to deal with any negative emotions and unhealthy mindset that you might have. So there's a number of things that you can work on within this category. And then when it comes to replacing, obviously this is going to go hand in hand with remove with many things, is you're going to replace your nutrition, for instance, with healthier non-inflammatory foods. But you're also going to take the stance of a non-toxic dietary and lifestyle habits. And again, this is going to be very unique to each person. But part of replace is also adding in nutrients to support your digestion. And here's some items here like bitters and enzymes and HCI, which is basically if you have low stomach acid, you're supporting that, and so forth. So you want to support your digestion here. And then you have reinoculate, and that's basically introducing beneficial bacteria back into your gut. And that can be in both food and supplement form. You've probably heard of fermentable or cultured vegetables, which are important. What I do want to say about this, though, is depending on your gut condition, some probiotics, whether it's in food or supplement form, can be aggravating to certain gut conditions. So it's very important to understand the differences in the probiotics and what they're targeted for in your gut. And then another big one is restore and repair. This is restoring gut with nutrients to repair and ensure your optimal nutrient levels. A lot of folks have less than optimal and even deficient nutrient levels, but they don't necessarily show up on regular blood tests. So this is where testing, again, is so imperative if you're really going to hit the target, so to speak. But there's also a lot of specific nutrients that can help repair damage to the mucosal lining and the irritation and inflammation in your gut. And this is going to be very important. And then the last one is, I call it life care. Now, I originally had it called self-care, but that has been such a overused, and it's a little misleading on self-care. Some people think it's a selfish type of situation, or you have to spend a lot of money on self-care. And I am absolutely not talking about that. So that the self-care term has been a little bit overused. So I wanted to change that. And really, life care is just doing something that is going to benefit your wellness. whether that's taking 5 minutes for a stroll in nature or a 10-minute, playtime with your doggy. Those are all things that are therapeutic. Whatever is going to be therapeutic and beneficial for your health really falls in this category. So of course, all of these other areas need to be addressed as part of your life care, but you also want to work on investing in your health and avoiding exposures to triggers, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then again, just making sure that you're having fun and taking care of yourself. The things that would fall into this category would be things like mindful breathing and meditation and things like that. We don't necessarily have to go to the spa to take care of ourselves and feel like we have our self-care, so to speak. So it's anything that's health encouraging and life enhancing care is so critical, because so many women especially, we're always so apt to take care of others and nurture others. We have to really make sure that we're nurturing ourselves too. So here's some specific actions that are a little bit more in detail, and we could do a presentation on or a masterclass on any one of these number of things, so we won't have time to go through these in detail, but I did want to give you an overview. And in many cases, you'll do a combination of these things over time. As you progress through managing your systems and uncovering and addressing root causes, you'll add more and more types of therapeutic things to your plan. And some of these will help you with symptoms, and some of them will actually help with root cause, because again, as I've mentioned, you may be working those synergistically together, right, at the same time, but some things you might just be helping with, like for instance, medications, which for most are not necessary, but you absolutely don't want to condemn yourself or feel shame if you're on them or you try them. Especially if you're dealing with very miserable symptoms and you get a medication. So please know that sometimes that can help, at least for short term, until you can start working on a more holistic plan. So when it comes to holistic and natural remedies to support symptom relief, and again, this is really also helps with root causes too. Obviously, you're going to have to make dietary changes, and what those dietary changes look like for you are going to be unique for you. There is not a one-size-fits-all to any of this. There's also going to be supplemental nutrition support that you're going to want, whether it's supplements to help with nutritional deficiencies or less than optimal nutrition, or what we talked about, repairing and rebuilding your gut. Also, there's supplemental things regarding natural remedies like herbals, botanicals, homeopathics, essential oils, things that are going to help with pathogen removal and eradication, or to support with, for instance, if you have candida overgrowth and things like that, they're natural remedies for that. You're also going to want to work with your mindset and emotion balance. Our mindset has a huge effect on our health, so you want to make sure that if there's negativity going on there, that you work on a balance there so you're more positive. You also want to work on stress management in your parasympathetic state, right? You want to be in the rest and digest state, especially when you're eating. And then there's also some things you can do. We talked about the migrating motor complex and the motility that's happening, the physical things that are happening, the things that are moving food through our digestive system, and the nerves that are working in order to stimulate all of that. You can actually do manual manipulation, and there's other therapeutic physical activities you can do to help with that. There's vagus nerve stimulation. There's visceral manipulation. So there are actually things, and you can look those things up on YouTube. You can also talk to, if you see a chiropractor, you can talk to your chiropractor, or maybe they can show you some of these moves. But if you look on YouTube, you're going to find a lot of good information about this type of manipulation. You can also see a massage therapist who focuses specifically on these type of things, because if you have structural damage and things going on with your vagus nerve, you're likely going to need, besides just some supplemental things that can actually help with that, you're going to probably need some manual manipulation. And then, of course, you also want to avoid triggers and items that exacerbate your problem, right? So we're going to go into looking at those. So basically this is a list, and of course it's not fully exhaustive, but this is a list on how to avoid triggers or what to avoid and things that exacerbate, right, that your problem. So these aren't necessarily root causes, but these can trigger flares in your symptoms. Or if you weren't having any problems, these can trigger, if you're already having problems, these can trigger your problems to be worse. So now, again, sometimes this can be part of the root cause, like for instance, the stressors and certain stressors. But the fact is that a lot of times these are triggers, and I call them. We want to avoid the crap foods, right? Crud, rich, and processed. So that's one of the inflammatory things that we can absolutely control, is to manage our processed food intake, and then of course managing our stressors, internal and external, that we talked about. And then the other things that we want to incorporate, as we talked about, is certain foods, fiber, probiotics, prebiotics, and exercise. These are all very important, but they can actually sometimes be turned against you. And what I mean by that is when we have food sensitivities. For instance, you might have a sensitivity to broccoli or chicken. Things that are healthy foods inherently, but because your system is not working properly, you have a sensitivity to them. And I do want to make it very clear, sensitivity is different than an allergy, and is different than an intolerance. And generally, especially for food sensitivities, most of the time you can overcome them. You can heal your gut and reintroduce them after a period of time and overcome food sensitivity. So don't think that if you have a lot of items you can't tolerate right now, that you won't be able to at some point. And then there's other things that can turn against you. Like for instance, if you have SIBO, certain probiotics and prebiotics and fiber can actually cause your symptoms to be much worse. Exercise can also, if it's too strenuous, for instance, can be too much of a stressor if your body is already under chronic stress. We all know how important activity is and exercise is. However, if we're dealing with a chronic stress situation, any kind of over-exercise or strenuous exercise can actually make it worse. So we have to manage that appropriately. Overeating, of course, is a huge burden on our system, so we want to be careful about that. Quality sleep is incredibly important. When we don't get that, our body doesn't go through the appropriate stages of recovery and healing during the time that we sleep, so that can actually trigger a lot of health problems. And of course, medication, alcohol, smoking, artificial sweeteners, aspartame, sucralose, saccharin, those are things that can actually trigger your problems to be worse. And then for some, not everyone, but for some, carbonated drinks can actually trigger on a symptom too. So you might have to, until your gut is healed, you might have to avoid carbonated drinks if it causes you too many problems. And I would say that if something causes your symptoms to be worse, or it causes your symptoms to flare, then it's probably best not to do it, because every time you do that, you are stressing your body and inflaming your body that much more. Now, the fact is that we can't fix something if we don't know what's wrong, right? Without doing this, it's like throwing darts with a blindfold on. In the end, you'll end up spending more money and being more frustrated, and all that is even more stressful and leads to being worse. And I, for one, totally understand about budgets and wondering how testing is going to get paid for. I've been through it. I've spent thousands, but I'm also wouldn't have the quality of health that I have now. I would probably be bedridden had I not done that. So I wouldn't have much of a life if I hadn't done testing and figured things out and dealt with the root cause. But it is so important to prioritize, though. And that's like, for instance, when I'm working with my clients, we prioritize things. We don't have to do every single test under the sun. We look at their history, we look at what their doctor can order and what their insurance will cover. And so we look at all of that in order to look at the testing. And, from a testing type standpoint, you're going to have testing for structural abnormalities. And we've kind of talked about that, the colonoscopy, the endoscopy, CT scans, things like that, which most of the time doctors will do and insurance covers. But then you also have physiological testing, which gets a little bit more invasive. it's just a little bit more specialized, and not all regular doctors will do this, but these are some of the things that insurance will most of the time cover, depending on your condition, like how fast are things going through your digestive tract, and what kind of motility issues and nerve damage do you have in your digestive tract. And then there's also the diagnostic and lab testing, right? This is a typical nutrient testing, food intolerance, food sensitivities. Again, those are different. Infections that are going on. What does your microbiome and your bacteria levels look like? Do you have SIBO? This is where most of this is not going to be done through a regular doctor and through insurance. And a lot of that is you're going to be working with a more functional medicine type practitioner like myself in order to have this type of testing done. But it is really going to help you target what you do to help address the root causes. So the next thing, I want to provide an illustration to help you see the complexity, yet how you can begin to look at your situation. And this is just an example of one or a couple of types of symptoms. So that we're going to go through the whys on this slide. So what is so important to understand is that you want to ask why, and you want to keep asking until you get to what you think is a root. So for instance, in this example with bloating and gas, first question somebody might ask, why? Well, because I eat certain foods, so I should just stop eating all those foods. Yes or no? Yes, you should start eating all those foods, but the buck doesn't stop there, right? You need to keep asking, but why would my body have a problem with those healthy foods? So you then ask, because I have food sensitivities and because the bacteria in my gut are fermenting certain carbohydrates I eat in the small intestine instead of the large intestine, which that's another problem, but it's still a little bit more downstream. So we ask, well, why is this happening? Well, you say, because I have SIBO and leaky gut. And once again, you're getting further upstream, but these are still symptoms of a root. So then we say, because my migrating motor complex is not functioning properly and I have a damaged intestinal barrier or hyperpermeability. Okay, we're getting there. We're getting there to where we understand more. If the migrating, as we talked about, if the migrating motor complex or MMC is not functioning properly, there is a lot of dysfunction that's going to take place in the gut. Okay, so the next why is because I eat inflammatory foods and I had food poisoning years ago. Okay, that might be it. So here's what we can do to control this. Number one, we can stop eating the inflammatory foods and change our nutrition. And for the food poisoning, we can't do anything about that years ago. But now we can start working on why this really happened and then start peeling the layers of the onion back to work on the remedies. So I always tell my clients that progress takes time. It is a process, and the journey usually does not look like a straight line going up, as you can see. It will trend up, but you might have still some ups and downs, right? Your day, some days, some moments in time might look like this here, you're struggling, and then you might have some days where you're just have so much relief and freedom, you just feel fantastic. And that's going to happen. That's going to be the process as you journey through overcoming your IBS. So what are your options? So you can do nothing and continue to suffer needlessly. Of course you can do that. You can take the DIY approach, right? Do it yourself. And there is a lot of great information on the internet. There's also a lot of not so great information and confusing and overwhelming information on the internet. So you want to be careful about that. And then you could also work with an expert. Now, just know that if you're doing the DIY approach or working with an expert, these are not mutually exclusive. You could be doing a lot of things on your own, a lot of research and a lot on your own, and working with an expert on just specific things like testing, for instance. Now, when you're investing in your health on your own, for those DIYers, and believe me, I am a DIYer myself. I've done a lot of things myself. I've also worked with a lot of practitioners and functional medicine doctors. So I've also done both. If you are doing it yourself, you want to be very wise and strategic about it. You don't want to just try one thing and give up. Some particular, for instance, if someone takes a herbal remedy, excuse me, for a particular symptom, and for some people it works fantastic and others it doesn't. Well, again, that's where we talked about there's not a one size fits all. If one person gives up gluten and they still have all their problems, and that was me, it means that gluten is not necessarily safe, but there's a lot of other things you have to work on that are not working for you. So don't just give up after you try something the first time. And then don't just try one thing, feel better, and think you have pulled out the root, because it's likely not the cause. I mean, it's likely not the case. And you want to learn about the complexities and the interconnectedness in our GI system in our body. So it's important to understand what's going on behind the scenes, so that you can make better decisions and choices as you move forward. And then you want to learn about the multitude of remedies and modalities and do your research. Make sure you're working with or you're looking at information that's reliable. Now, if you want to invest in your health with an expert, you want to get a helping hand to hold your hand, so to speak. This is going to help you avoid overwhelm, which would make it worse. And it will also help you to understand the complexities of the GI problem and guide you through the process of overcoming. It's also good to work with someone that has had personal experience, and Carrie and I have both had personal experience with IBS issues and the cascade of troubles that occur around it. Also want someone that has some kind of formal education and training around the gut, and someone that can help you with some deeper dive testing, and someone that's going to provide full support and accountability to help navigate you through the entire journey. And then especially someone that is not going to give up. You want your practitioner to be very persistent and very supportive. I have a client that calls me a hound dog because I just kept digging and digging until we figured it out and she was able to overcome. And some people, it's a little bit easier to figure things out than others, and you just want a practitioner that is never going to give up. So here's your chance to get answers to your questions. We're finished with the masterclass. Hopefully it didn't overwhelm you too much and you took some good notes. And then I know Carrie is going to share this video for you to watch it over and over. But here's your chance to get answers to your questions. We want to be sure and provide you answers. So please send in your questions to Carrie, and then we will collaborate in order to get them answered. And by watching this masterclass, you've already taken a wonderful step into investing in your health. And I applaud you for taking the time to learn and become more informed about IBS and what you can do to have your healthy life back. So feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'd love to hear from you. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day, and God bless you.
Oh my goodness, Kelly, thank you so much. So much good information in this class. My head is kind of spinning, and I know that so many of you guys will find a lot of answers to your questions in here and get a lot of, if not necessarily specific answers, at least hope and encouragement for you to keep going on your gut healing journey. So you can find Kelly over at her website, kellywilhite.com. And if you have any questions about this presentation, about IBS, maybe particular concerns about your case, I invite you to send me your questions. You can leave them in the comments below this video, or you can send them to carriesaintcoaching@gmail.com. And in the next coming weeks, Kelly and I will be collaborating and answering your questions via video. So send your questions, any question that you may have, and we look forward to hearing from you. Kelly, once again, thank you for sharing with us. We enjoyed having you here, and I hope you guys all have a blessed day. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.